talking about different sects of Judaism, like what doesn't need to be religious? Is it about halacha? Is it about spirituality? Is it about the way you connect to your community? Is it about the way you feel about God?
If we were to say that Judaism is sort of a free-form term, does that effectively make it meaningless? Do you think, are there red lines that are okay for us to now say, this is no longer sort of my type of Judaism that I identify with?
When you say something like, that's not my Judaism, for sure, because there is no one Judaism.
Welcome to Future Tense, a show that puts today's biggest Jewish questions in the hands of the leaders of tomorrow. I'm Anna Weiss. During my initial college search, I wanted a school with a small enough Jewish community that I had access to it, but not too big that I would fall back into a Jewish bubble, and I found it. However, I was almost 2 months into college when I first met a fellow observant Jew. To my surprise, I felt so alone in that community. With nobody having gone to the same schools or camps or programs, playing Jewish geography was barely possible. There was nobody to talk to about missing so many classes for Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot who could relate. I struggled to find a happy medium at that college, meeting Jews who shared both my values and my practices. With changing Jewish values and attitudes, it can be difficult to be in spaces where we truly feel seen by other Jewish people. Existing in a Jewish space doesn't always mean existing with people who see and understand you. At that college, I felt respected in my Judaism, but not understood. I felt recognized in my Judaism, but not in my personal Jewish identity. At my new college, Muhlenberg College, there's a lot more diversity in Jewish practice, and I'm far from being the only observant Jewish student. Whereas at my last university, there's diversity in background and identity school-wide. At Muhlenberg, there's diversity in background and identity within the Jewish community. Enough, in fact, that we have kosher dining available in the main campus dining hall, both meat and dairy, and enough that they kosher the meat side for Pesach. This past Pesach, there was a day where I was standing in line at the Nosh, the name of our campus's kosher food section, and started talking to someone else in line. We had never spoken before. I don't even know her name, but as we co-commiserated over the struggle of maintaining kosher for Pesach while at school, I felt so understood, recognized in the way that I practiced my Judaism. I felt so connected to this person because of our similar Jewish practice. At the same time, as my image changes with piercings, tattoos, and brightly dyed hair, I fear that others in my community have started viewing me different, as less Jewish, disconnected from the Jewish community, and have, as some would say, gone off the derech. As Judaism is a religion and culture that allows for diversity in practice and values, we grow up with different events, experiences, and foods feeling like home. Whatever our identity or practice, as we navigate the world as growing Jewish people, we want to continue to feel seen and understood by Jews around us. In my experience, I've been surprised where I have and have not felt recognized in my Jewish identity in the way that I connect to Judaism. I would like to welcome my wonderful co-hosts, Sami Jinich and Yadid Orlow.
Hey, Anna. Happy to be joining you guys.
I want to open up by asking, have you ever had experiences where you expected to feel seen in your Judaism, but weren't?
Yeah, I can speak to this quite extensively, honestly. I think, first example, both my parents are Mexican Jews. So I grew up being exposed to a very different sort of set of customs, a different way of relating to the outside world and the non-Jews in the Mexican Jewish community than what I got in the American Jewish community in Maryland, where I grew up. And I do feel like there were many times where American and Israeli Jewish spaces that I was in failed to recognize or sometimes forgot that there is this other sort of set of Jews that live all, in different countries all over the world. Things like sort of how we relate to each other and others. And also, people often bash on Ashkenazi food for being very bland. But when it comes out of Mexico, it's great. We actually put that to it. It tastes amazing. So there's this whole sort of set of customs and things and this aspect of my Jewish identity that I think often goes unrecognized. And another thing is that I went to a pluralistic Jewish day school, elementary school, but I grew up rather secular in my house. And so when I got to Israel for the Hartman Institute's Chibur Gap Year program, I found that I was rather, quote unquote, religiously illiterate, you might say. I didn't know much about Talmud or how to read it. I didn't really know that the Judaism we were practicing was rabbinic Judaism. And I think that's an important distinction if we're relating ourselves to, Jews of the past and biblical Jews. And so while I'd like to say that, I think we should be a big camp and we should welcome all Jews and see everyone as they are. I also do think that, to some extent, it's important to have some shared knowledge or some shared background. And I have been in that place where I felt like I'm lacking the ability to communicate with other Jews or to be seen. And I think on the one hand, that's not necessarily on me. I think it's on, Orthodox Jews, for example, to be more open to, my version of being Jewish. But also, I think it's tough when, I'm at a big Passover Seder and only two of us know how to do the prayers. So it's definitely a tough balance to strike. And I'm excited to talk to you all about it.
It's really fascinating because I guess acknowledging the two different facets of what you just pointed out, like I personally am an Argentinian Jew, but in having conversations with my grandparents and great-grandparents from Argentina, that actually hasn't felt particularly like distinctly Argentinian. And it has felt much more so they make sure to consistently speak in Yiddish. They make sure to maintain this like Germanic culture and like Pale of Settlement culture. And it's really interesting to me how, on the first hand, you seem to have a very clear understanding of what Mexican Judaism is. And considering my personal experiences of Argentinian Judaism, it actually feels as though they're not trying to be unique, or as though like there isn't even a uniqueness to them because of how much of a reflection they are to like the larger Ashkenazi Jewish sphere. Secondly, I'm wondering, and this emerged out of your second point, Sami, you had mentioned how you had felt this experience of literacy and reflecting on your literacy. And it reminds me of a conversation I was having with a bunch of my friends the other day of what Judaism even is. And there was a point when one of the more observant kids in the conversation actually stood up and said, I believe that Judaism is about observing halacha, like Jewish law, and Reform Jews are not doing that, so they're not Jewish.
Yeah, I've experienced that growing up in the modern Orthodox community. I experienced a lot of down talking to other denominations, even clumping them together, a lot of clumping together. Oh, conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism. That's not real Judaism. They're both kind of fake, which also that comment disregards, first of all, their very different stance and practice in relation to halacha, but also just downgrades and disrespects the way that so many people do practice and connect to their Judaism. I've also heard people make comments like saying that Jewish people who aren't observant or who aren't religious is the real problem. Like they're the reason why our community is suffering or why the Jewish people are suffering. And so, I hear people make comments like, oh, I'm only kind of Jewish, or like I'm Jewish. And so the conversation of like, what does it mean to be Jewish enough? Who gets to decide that? Why is that even disagreement or like an argument that we're having?
Yeah, there's a book I read by Robert Mnookin called The Jewish American Paradox. And something that he says in this book, basically the entire book, is him arguing to make as big a camp as possible. Because, I think he would agree with a lot of what you said, that in not recognizing, all the different sects of Judaism that exist, we do lose a lot of, a lot of people, but also, a lot of customs. And I would argue that just because you're a Reformed Jew doesn't mean you're not a religious Jew. Certainly there are many non-observant Reformed Jews, but there are also, there are Reformed rabbis who devote their entire life to it. But at the same time, making a big camp, where we recognize anybody who wants to be Jewish as Jewish, it doesn't mean that a Reformed Jew is going to feel super welcomed in an Orthodox synagogue, right? They might still not like being, with a mechitza. They might still not like not understanding all the prayers that are going on. And I think it's okay possibly to have our own sort of particular pockets where our practice is more similar to each other and where I know that I'll fit in best, while still, not calling each other fake Jews or bad Jews.
Yeah, I think that also kind of points to, again, this conversation of like, what does it mean to be Jewish? Are there things that we're supposed to have in common? I'm also reflecting on what you're talking about, Mexican Judaism, and that it has a lot of Ashkenazi practices, foods, thinking also about the Chavruta Gap Year program, how much we discussed how like Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews are like pushed to the background and how Ashkenazi kind of ends up being the default way that we practice, and how a lot of Jewish people end up feeling left out through there. And also even talking about different sects of Judaism, like what does it need to be religious? Is it about halacha? Is it about spirituality? Is it about the way you connect to your community? Is it about the way you feel about God? which also makes me think of the multiple facets of Judaism, like cultural, religious, language, history, ancestry, so on and so forth. I don't know. I'm curious about what you guys think regarding that. What is the common knowledge? What does it mean for us to practice? What are things that we have in common as Jewish people?
I might be a bit of a skeptic here, but I really don't think there's that much other than us calling ourselves Jews. And, I think, like you said, there's many different categories of what makes Judaism Judaism. There's the cultural, the ethnic or nationalist, there's the, of course, religious components and food and whatnot. But I don't think that every Jew has one thing that, makes them Jewish or makes them sort of common. And I think, there's a metaphor that some of us were chatting with each other about earlier about ice cream and how if I'm a Reformed Jew, say that I really love Rocket Pops, and I, for some reason, call that ice cream. And there's a, Orthodox Jew who really likes lemon sorbet, and they also call that ice cream. And we can bond over how much we love ice cream, but then once we get and go order our food, it turns out we like totally different things and they have very little in common, other than that we call both of them desserts or ice cream. And what use is there to sort of categorizing these in the same bucket? And I think you could argue either way. Like maybe it is problematic that we are calling all ourselves all the same thing when there's maybe a common ancestry to or origin to what we are, but maybe there's not that much substance. Maybe you guys could correct me on that, but I do feel that it's somewhat arbitrary.
I guess you had mentioned the culture and religion and the food. And the food reminded me of this moment. This past summer, I was working at the head of the kitchen at the summer camp I grew up at. And there was a point on Friday when the guy who was delivering bread rolled in, non-Jewish Ukrainian dude, wonderful man. And as we're unloading these bread crates from his truck, he paused and he said, "It smells like you're cooking Jewish food." And I had a moment of pause because I didn't know there was such thing as Jewish food. And I think that it really begged a question for me then, and especially now in this conversation, of what Jewish actually means. And if we were to say, as you guys seem to be like suggesting, that Judaism is sort of a free-form term, does that effectively make it meaningless?
I think that's also thinking about labels and how we label ourselves. Labels can be really helpful for us to communicate who we are to other people, and a quick way of like, oh, I'm this, so now people can think these things of me. But they can also be really hurtful and really reductive. And it can be difficult because, right, like me and Sami both identify as Jewish. I know the way that we grew up is very different, and our practices are very different, and our observance is very different, and the way that we interact with other Jewish communities is really different. And so that also points to like, our label is helpful, the label of Judaism. What does it mean, and what is it communicating to other people and to other Jewish people? And as we're talking about these things, as we're grappling with that discussion of labels and what it means to be Jewish enough, how Jewish people criticize the practices and opinions of other Jewish people, I think it's the perfect time to bring in and introduce our guest, Sara Labaton. Sara Labaton is the Director of Teaching and Learning at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Her research interests explore ritual practice, ritual innovation, and medieval biblical interpretation. Welcome, Sara. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think I actually want to turn it to Sami for our first question.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, Sara. I wanted to ask you about something that we have just talked about, sort of this idea of common knowledge. I had the opportunity to connect with Jews from all sorts of backgrounds through Hartman's Gap Year program. And I've always felt that there is something that binds us all together, even if I can't name exactly what it is. But like we discussed, there were also some points of tension where many secular and Hiloni or observant Jews, didn't always connect on the same level, understanding the same background on holidays. We felt like there wasn't common knowledge. And I, myself have felt like I haven't always had that common knowledge or literacy. And that's something I struggle with, sort of, wanting to embrace all Jews as they are, but also feeling like there should be something that binds us more substantive. And so I'm curious to hear from you what you think that common knowledge looks like or should look like. And also, how can secular Jews feel seen in observant spaces without simply being seen as quote unquote confused Jews?
I love that question so much, Sami. I consider myself fortunate that I grew up in a pretty small community on the Jersey Shore, which was a Syrian Jewish community. And yet my mother is Ashkenaz, and part of her family is Hasidic. The other part of her family has been American, proud Americans, fourth generation Americans living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And as I grew up and went to college and then graduate school, I spent time in lots of different Jewish communities or had different Jewish experiences, ranging from spending time in Belarus running Jewish camps for Belarusian Jewish children, spending a year in Germany after college, living in Israel for 4 years. And I guess something that you said made me think about the importance of, on the one hand, having a space where you can really bring your full Jewish self. You need to feel comfortable. And as a Jew in that space with Jews who practice or believe similarly as you. But simultaneously, there is something that's so enriching and exciting and thrilling about seeking out Jewish spaces where you're not that comfortable, which really push against some of your practices or your beliefs. And I can think of so many experiences that I've had where that discomfort was present. So, for example, in college, I had an internship at a progressive Jewish organization. It was on the far left. This was years ago at this point. And I was an intern, and I learned so much. I grew so much. And this came out of a course that I took on theorizing activism. It was at Barnard College. But at the board meeting, they served non-kosher pizza. And it felt like a clash of my identities. Like I just didn't know exactly what to do with that. And of course, it comes through with language. And, when I was a counselor in Belarus or Minsk, we needed official translators. We couldn't communicate. And somehow we managed to sing together, learn together, even though, wow, our backgrounds were as radically different as they could be. And if I brought together Jews who I've encountered throughout my life and travels, if I brought them together, I don't know that they could find anything in common. And certainly some of them would not consider the other ones to actually, quote unquote, be Jewish. I don't know that there is a common core, so to speak, that Jews need to have or to access in order to be part of this thing we call the Jewish people. If they want to access Jewish history or Jewish texts, or if they want to go deep on, I don't know, the origin story of Judaism, then yeah, I guess they need some tools to access that. But to partake in this identity, I really would argue that if they want to show up as Jews who are committed to the Jewish people, and maybe I'll quote one of my colleagues that to be a Jewish leader, you can't just love Judaism, but you have to love Jews, all Jews. Then, please come, welcome. In Arabic, we would say fadal, and in Yiddish, I think we would say gesintahey. You are here, you're part of it.
I want to agree with you fully, but I think there is something that makes me a bit uncomfortable, which is that I think for our own purposes, it's great to, again, make this camp really big and welcome people as they are. But also, I think as is the case with any minority, we're often, anything that one Jew does is going to be seen as representative, right, of the Jewish people. And so if I have no say or no control in deciding who I can identify with, what if there's a sect of Judaism that I don't want to recognize, not because I think it's like fake Judaism, but because they're doing something that I think misrepresents me? I know now we hear a lot of people saying, oh, not in my name, or this is not my Judaism. Are there red lines that are okay for us to now say, this is no longer sort of my type of Judaism that I identify with?
Yeah. I mean, I have friends who will say that I have very few boundaries when it comes to that. I think my red line on that front is what might be termed Jews for Jesus or Messianic Jews. We sort of grew up with this idea that that was a fringe cult, but I've learned this from colleagues of mine who teach theology and teach in interfaith spaces, that it's a growing movement and it's not a cult. I mean, there are cultic manifestations of it, but that it is a real movement. And that is my red line for all sorts of reasons. But I think that, the point is when you say something like, that's not my Judaism, for sure, because there is no one Judaism. There are Judaisms, and on the individual level, everybody is going to be their own idiosyncratic, weird, maybe you might call it a shopping cart Jew. That you can put together your own weird amalgam, and it can be delightful and alienating to other people, or it could be resonant, it can be attractive, and it could also be revolting to people. I mean, we see that. That's what the discourse, I think, has become a bit toxic in that regard. And on a communal level, when it comes to building community, I think we have to recognize that whenever we're a part of a community, there are going to be things that are really comfortable and resonant and familiar. And then there are going to be things in that same community that just don't perfectly check all of the boxes. So as an example, I'm spending the year in Israel right now, but my home community, my home synagogue community, which I love very dearly, I am one of a few women who wear a tallis, and that feels great. And it's a modern Orthodox shul. And it's also hard for me that at my son's bar mitzvah, I couldn't be on the bima with him, and I didn't have an aliyah. That was challenging. And certainly there are going to be speakers in the synagogue who I might prefer not have a platform. But I think that's okay. I think that's good, because then there are going to be speakers who I am really excited about, but I know other people don't love what they have to say. So I think that what's important is we can show up with as full of ourselves as possible. And I think we should be really intentional and thoughtful about how we absorb and encounter the things in our communities that maybe make us cringe or maybe we find difficult and alienating. And I see this, by the way, as a parent when it comes to schools. Like during your conversation, I was really brought back to my college experiences where, I took this whole range of courses, including with people at Columbia University who are now in the news. And I found that so exhilarating. And now at this stage of life, I experience that more through my kids' educations. And I just had this. My kids are in a school this year, which is certainly more politically and religiously conservative than I am. And for my son's Passover, homework, we read about how the daughter is helping her mom clean and the son is learning with his dad. And I was like, in our house, it doesn't happen like that. And he was like, yeah, and it's my 8-year-old son. He's like, yeah, that's problematic. I don't agree with that either. So I felt like it was an educational opportunity to kind of say, this is what you're hearing. That is a real sector of Jewish life and practice. It's not what we do in our home, but it's good for you to experience that and to encounter it. And I would also say that I adored and respected my kids' teachers, and more important, they adored and respected their teachers. So I was able to say that we can disagree, strongly disagree, with people we love, learn from, and look up to.
2 quick things. First of all, you had mentioned that you had spent some time in Belarus. Was that through the YUSSR?
Sure was.
That's actually really interesting because my dad was also involved in the YUSSR Jewish Camp Project in Belarus. And thinking about you, Sara, and my dad, there was a really interesting thought because earlier you had used language of Jewish peoplehood. And I remember in having a lot of conversations like the ones we're having now, he uses language of the Jewish project. And thinking about the contrast in that language, I think that to Sami's point, I'm wondering if there's a literacy problem. And imagining the situation where you're at Pesach Seder and you're the only one that really knows what's happening, how have you navigated this conversation of what makes someone Jewish if they're not contributing to this mission that you see Judaism to be?
I think that showing up as a Jew is enough. So to use the line from the Seder, Dayenu. I think that we need everybody And we need the people who are driving the mission and who are the visionaries and who are leading. And we also need the people who do other things and contribute in other ways to this Jewish project. I do think that this might be an unpopular opinion. I went to day school my entire life. I went to graduate school. I literally spent 4 summers in high school learning Torah. I told my kids that and they could not get over that. They were like, wow, we didn't realize you were that nerdy. Now, that said, it's not for everybody. And I think the incredible thing about Judaism is that there's so many portals with which to access it. And certainly, I believe in investing in Jewish literacy and education. That is my love language, but it's not for everybody. And I think that we need to think creatively about how to invest in the groups and not just invest in like making them more Jewish or anything like that, but really think creatively about how to open up Judaism for them and how to let Judaism be shaped by them. For the people who are not interested in being fully literate, quote unquote, and I don't even know if I love that word, but maybe they're not language people and they don't want to crack their teeth on Hebrew and biblical Hebrew and Aramaic. And that's only a few of the Jewish languages that you could, use and access. I don't know. I think there are very profound possibilities for Jewish life without Jewish literacy. I don't think that you need to be Jewishly knowledgeable and literate to be, certainly not to be Jewish, but to lead a rich Jewish life. And I think we need to envision that in really serious ways. I'll just say one last thing about that. My childhood best friend is on the far right. She lives in Israel and she's on the far right politically, I should say, not religiously. And at this point, by the way, we are 3rd generation friends and our kids are 4th generation friends. So it's something very powerful. And we spent time camping with her family and her extended in-law family, who are also on the right. And her in-laws were trying to convince me to stay in Israel. And one of them said, we need good Jews like you in Israel. And my friend and I turned to each other and laughed. And we both said, you might not think that I'm actually such a good Jew because I'm definitely not voting the way that you would want me to vote or practicing or doing the way that you want me to practice and behave and think and believe. So even that question of like, what makes a good Jew? It's so arbitrary, and I think we're better off moving away from that. I don't even know what it means.
You'd mentioned the good Jew versus non-Jew and how to present yourself as a Jew. And it reminded me of this story. I was talking to my cousin about different expressions of Judaism and how that interacts with politics. And they told me about a time when their friend asked them if they should be wearing tefillin to an anti-Israel protest. And I remember very distinctly my cousin saying, if you don't normally wear tefillin, why would you wear them now?
Mm.
And this exchange made me think, how are we seen and how do we see other Jews? And what is the clothing, jewelry, and religious garb that we choose to wear or notice in others signal about our values and practices and lovers of religiosity? I think moreover, there's also a question there of to what extent is the way that we present ourselves through these different symbols a matter of sincere practice or performative acts?
Yeah. I find that every time I start wearing something, I just lose it. It might be an expensive item or it might not be, but I've gone through 10 hostage pins at this point and ribbons. And I think that there's something really powerful about visual remembrances. When we think about, for example, tzitzit and techelet, the light blue or indigo string that's part of that garment, there is rabbinic traditions about how the blue is meant to make you think of the heavens, and which in itself is supposed to evoke God and God's majesty. I think that there's so many ways that material culture is not just a way of presenting ourselves to the world, but it's also a way of shaping who we are religiously, psychically, ethically, spiritually. And it almost goes back to that question that you raised about synagogues, or that Sami raised about spaces. And, we're always going to be somewhat comfortable and somewhat uncomfortable. There are going to be ways in which these objects, whether they're, the hostage pins or tefillin, something that is ancient and goes back. In either case, they're going to represent parts of who we are, and they're not going to fully represent who we are. So maybe I'll just give a couple of examples of that. Tefillin is actually one of my favorite examples. And I've gone through stages where I had my pair of tefillin. Of course, I lost them, and times where I've worn them consistently and times where I haven't. And I think, though, if we look at the origins of tefillin, at least according to some scholars, there's a great book which lays this out. It's called Tangled Up in Text by Yehuda Cohn. Tefillin originated as like a Jewish amulet influenced by Hellenistic amulets. And they were meant to be things that you wore to protect you from all sorts of danger that ancient people really objectively encountered or thought that they were encountering. And then tefillin goes through an evolution. So, for example, Maimonides, the medieval Jewish philosopher, would never want to see tefillin as something that's talismanic or magical or as an amulet. So instead, he sees things like tefillin as something that it facilitates an encounter with God. And it reminds you of your obligations. And then if you fast forward and you think about all sorts of imagery associated with tefillin in the modern world, I mean, you have tefillin Barbie, and then you have Chabad laying them outside baseball stadiums. There are just so many ways in which tefillin as a practice and as a material object has changed and adapted. And, if your cousin's friend wants to wear it to a protest, even if it's making a statement, I would argue that anybody who's wearing tefillin, even if they're wearing them every day, is that not some type of performance? Is that not also making some type of a statement? I don't see that object as belonging more authentically or less authentically to anybody. And I think the fact that it has just been interpreted and reinterpreted in so many different ways just testifies to that. And I think that, there's truth to that with other objects as well, that again, in this particular atmosphere where it's hard to believe, but even the cause of the hostages has become politicized, and you're either, on one side or on the other side. And I think it's okay to invest that symbolism with the whatever, personal or political or social meaning that you want to. So if it serves as a way of broadcasting to the world, Iska Achshav, there should be a ceasefire now to save the hostages, fine. And if instead it's your reminder when you are davening, when you are praying, to pray for them, also fine. But I don't think that dress or symbolism should belong to one group or another. And I think that as Jews, we should feel empowered to invest these symbols with the meaning that we want to.
I think this actually perfectly helps transition into another question I have for you. When we're talking about religious symbols, and we're also talking about what they can mean in our day-to-day life, about how we connect to Judaism, but also our politics. So in the current political sphere, there's a lot of division between the Jewish people surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict. And there's been a lot of judgment between Jewish groups and on campus and between Jewish communities. And for Jewish students on both ends, people feel really misunderstood and disrespected in their Jewish identities. And so we've talked about physical symbols that we use, but we also use, in this day and age, social media to express our views and opinions about these topics. So I'm wondering what you could say about how do we navigate the perception of ourselves and others when we talk or post on social media about certain topics and not others? What about posting about a range of views on the same topic? Does that feel possible? What about like the lack of posting things? Is that a thing to be concerned about? Is that a thing that people look out for?
I find generally, and I don't think that this is any chiddush, this is nothing that's particularly insightful or new, but I think working things out in conversation, face to face or over the phone, not over text, there's just more potential there. Of course, it's limited. And yet, I think that there is something about having an interpersonal relationship as a foundation, which allows us to hear each other in a more generous and more open way. At the same time, first of all, we live in a world which is dominated by social media, and I think that we need to reckon with that. And maybe this exists and I just don't know about it, but I wish that there were kind of ethics, like the ethics of social media usage, whether it's consumption or production, like just the conventional ethical rules and guidelines about this. And I sometimes feel like things happen too fast on social media for guidelines or ethics to actually take hold. I am thinking back to another experience I had in college, which it's going to sound very far afield, but hear me out. I took a drawing class with an artist who is actually a Jewish artist who illustrated the 613 mitzvot, but that's another story. It turned out I had like zero abilities or talents, and that did not come as a surprise, but it was also one of my favorite classes. And one of the assignments was to go to a church and draw the perspectives or something like that. Like we had to draw angles, perspectives. And I happened to go on Ash Wednesday and met one of the monks. And we got to talking. And he said to me, he asked me what I was working on. And I said, perspective. And he said, you should stick around for the service. And then he winked at me, said, it's all about perspective, which I thought was a great line. And I sat and I listened to the priest's homily, and it stuck with me. This is like 20 years later. The priest quoted my cousin Vinny, where Marissa Tomei, I think, says to Vinny asks her to change her clothes for this Southern courtroom. And Marissa Tomei looks at Vinny and says, right, Vinny, because you blend, you really blend. In other words, they're both standing out in terms of their dress and their accents and everything. And the priest continued and said, as Catholics, we always blend in, except on Ash Wednesday, when we have a cross made out of ashes on our foreheads. And that's when we stand out. And one of the passages which was read where Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for religious exhibitionism, for kind of visually always showing their identity. What I got from that, and of course there was something a little bit triggering to hear the New Testament's take on the Pharisees for me as a rabbinic Jew, but I thought the point was well taken, that there are times in life where we express, and whether we express with our words or we express with what we're wearing, what's on our bodies, what we say, and where that actually feels really important. It doesn't have to be all the time. It doesn't have to be nonstop. It doesn't have to be every thought. And I think that there's a message there for social media that if it feels like there's something that you've thought about deeply, feels important to project or to broadcast out into the world, it's a way of identifying yourself. Okay, great, put it out there. But it doesn't have to be your only medium for expressing and identifying. And I think that it's okay to use it judiciously, strategically. That's what I would say in response.
And we live in a world where there is an increasing tokenizing of identity, and people are more and more so inclined to actually embrace the fact that whatever's on their sleeve is who they are as a person, for better or for worse. And I think that we would be remiss in not acknowledging that while in an ideal world, that wouldn't be the case, and we would be able to have conversations of depth and really pause and talk out the nuance. I don't know if that's necessarily true. And to the point of the monk in the story that you'd brought up, perspective is essential, but not necessarily realistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right to push on that, Yadid. And I also think that we can also be countercultural in deploying social media, in either not employing it at all or refusing to be fully identified with what's on our sleeves. And maybe if that's even a metaphor, putting lots of different things and even conflicting things on our sleeves, and actually pushing back on some of the ideological purity and orthodoxy that maybe social media demands. I sometimes wonder if in the constant stream of or cycle of social media, like the true proportions of the current tragedy in Gaza get lost. Shouting is not going to save Gazans. And with all of the time and with all of the energy of liking or reposting, let's also think about what actually helps, like what is actually constructive, what is actually in our power, if anything, to do.
Thank you so much, Sara. This was a wonderful conversation. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge and your stories.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our guest, Sara Labaton. Future Tense is produced by me, Tessa Zitter, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. Our faculty advisor is Deb Bearer, and our production assistant is Anna Light. This show is edited by Ben Azevedo at Bear Cave Audio and features theme music by Gabe Scherzer. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website, typically a week after an episode airs. We'd like to hear from you about the show. If you have comments on this episode or have ideas for future episodes or seasons, please write to us at futuretense@shalomhartman.org. To keep up with Future Tense and the Shalom Hartman Institute, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Shalom Hartman Institute. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.